hearing will come to order. Good morning. Thank you for joining the Subcommittee on Africa and Global Health for this important hearing entitled Great Lakes Region, Current Conditions and U.S. Policy. The Great Lakes region of Central Africa is perhaps the richest, most verdant area of the continent. It is the home to vast forests and wilderness areas, lush agricultural land, extensive mineral deposits, a wealth of biological diversity, and of course thousands of lakes. The richness is undoubtedly what attracted King Leopold of Belgium to Congo. In his attempt to transform Belgium into an empire in the late 1880s, he remotely created a living nightmare in Congo based on the grotesquely violent opposition of native Congolese for the purpose of exporting Congo's rich natural resources to Europe. For decades, the region's wealth washed ashore in ships at ports in Antwerp, and Congo's loss became Leopold and Belgium's gain. As destructive as the rape of the Congo was on the country's natural resources, the impact on its people is immeasurable and still plays out today. Yet, its impact is still misunderstood and underestimated. As chairman of the subcommittee and a former teacher, I believe we must understand the history of any region or people. If we're not fully able to understand, we are not able to bring it up to its present situation. Many of the problems we see today can be traced back to history. The roots of the instability and destruction of the Great Lakes region are found in Leopold's legacy. Now that we have that foundation, let me bring us up to date to more recent history. The Great Lakes region has been in crisis since the early 1990s, although conditions have improved in the past year. Shortly after Rwandan genocide in 1994, millions of civilians and ex-combatants fled to the Democratic Republic of Congo. The former Rwandese armed forces launched an insurgency in the late 1994, targeting the survivors of the Rwanda genocide. In May 1997, the Alliance of Democratic Forces for the Liberation of Congo Zaire, AFDL, with the support of Rwanda and Uganda, marched into Kinshasa and ousted longtime dictator Mobutu Sese Seko. Within 1 year, however, tensions between President Laurent Kabila and his Rwandan and Ugandan allies began to mount. In August 1998, open conflict erupted between Kabila and the Congolese forces supported by Rwanda. Angola, Namibia, and Zimbabwe joined the fighting in support of Kabila, plunging the region once again into a major crisis. In July 1999, at a summit in Lusaka, Zambia, the leaders of Uganda, Rwanda, Congo, Zimbabwe, Namibia, and Angola signed a peace agreement. The signing of the peace agreement, however, did not bring peace and stability in the Great Lakes region. Armed groups from Rwanda, Burundi, Uganda, and the DRC continued to target civilians and government forces in DRC and Rwanda. In 2008, Rwanda and DRC launched a joint military operation against these forces. The military operation severely weakened these armed groups. Nevertheless, the DRC continues to face insurgency and major humanitarian crisis, especially in eastern Congo, fueled by a resource grab. The humanitarian crisis in eastern Congo has captured the attention of thousands of Americans across the country. Rape and sexual violence are used as a weapon of war in numbers that are simply unimaginable. In addition, the Lord's Resistance Army led by Joseph Kony continues to wreak havoc through the region and into Sudan. Beyond these security concerns, there are also issues of democracy and governance. Burundi and Rwanda face presidential elections this summer. President Kabila has called for the withdrawal of the United Nations mission MONUC by 2011. Meanwhile, the DRC needs strong engagement from the international community to build institutions, and Uganda has been at the center of a controversy over a draconian anti-homosexuality bill. The United States continues to play a key role in an effort to bring about peace, stability, and development in the Great Lakes region. The purpose of today's hearing is to receive an update on a variety of issues facing the region and how U.S. policy efforts are addressing the major challenges that remain. To provide an insight, we are joined here on this panel by two distinguished officials, Ambassador Johnnie Carson and Mr. Franklin Moore, whose bios will be read following the members' opening statement. We thank you both, Mr. Carson and Mr. Franklin, for participating in today's hearings. We also planned a private panel, but due to traveling schedules of several of the witnesses, we have postponed that portion of the hearing to a later date. Before I recognize the ranking member, let me recognize members of the diplomatic corps. I know that in our front row we are joined by Ambassador Matifu of the DRC. I'm happy to have you with us. And other diplomatic representatives, and maybe those representatives from the Great Lakes regions who are in the audience. If you would all stand, I'd appreciate it. And beyond that, great. Thank you. We have others in addition to the Great Lakes region who are also present with us. At this time, we'll turn over to our ranking member, to Mr. Smith of New Jersey, for his opening remarks.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you for calling this very important hearing and providing this opportunity for the subcommittee to hear from Assistant Secretary Johnnie Carson and Deputy Assistant Administrator Franklin Moore about the critical issues related to the African Great Lakes region. We are fortunate to be able to hear directly from Assistant Secretary Carson about his just completed trip to Uganda. It will be useful to hear his assessment of the situation there leading up to the 2011 presidential and parliamentary elections, and what reaction he received to Congress's passage of the LRA Disarmament and Northern Uganda Recovery Act, which the President signed into law just last evening. It is my sincere hope that this legislation will achieve its goal of supporting civilian protection and development in Northern Uganda. It also will be particularly timely to hear whether he received any indication as to how Uganda intends to vote on the Iran sanctions resolution being circulated in the UN Security Council. The international community is rightly concerned about whether Iran's dangerous nuclear ambitions can be reined in through a coordinated and effective global response. Uganda's vote as a non-permanent member of the Council on this resolution is a key element to the answer to that question. I will also be interested in our witnesses' assessment of the elections that are currently underway in Burundi. The outcome of these elections and whether they are conducted fairly and peacefully is considered by many as a precursor to what can be expected for the August 9th presidential election in Rwanda. The stability of both countries, as well as that of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, is interrelated, not only because of the geographical proximity of the three countries, but also because of their related ethnic demographics and historic refugee flows. Democracy and peace for the entire region, or oppression and violence, are potentially at stake with the political outcome in each country. I appreciate that our distinguished witnesses will be addressing sexual and gender-based violence and human trafficking in the region, and in particular in the DRC. Assistant Secretary Carson will recall that when he was with us for a previous hearing just 2 months ago, I referenced the visit that I had made to the DRC and my inquiry about Monouk 2 years ago. Not only were serious allegations being made against peacekeeping soldiers, but the UN Office of Internal Oversight Services, the OIOS, that is responsible for investigating those allegations, was moving its personnel to Nairobi, Kenya, far from where it could effectively fulfill its mandate. Recently, I was informed that one OIOS investigator still is permanently based in Goma. Given the seriousness and the scope of this problem in the DRC, I will be interested to hear about what, if any, efforts have been successfully made by our government to reestablish a sufficient number of permanent OIOS investigators in the country, and in particular in Goma. A deeply troubling issue that has receiving increased attention both in the media and here in Congress concerns the President's emergency plan for AIDS relief. U.S. implementing partners for HIV/AIDS programs in Uganda have received a letter from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention stating that in 2010 and 2011, each partner should expect to have a flat-lined budget for antiretroviral procurement, and that patients in need of antiretroviral therapy should be enrolled only if new patients can be supported without a future increase in funding. This policy, apparently implemented without advance warning to the implementing partners, is resulting in serious and perhaps unforeseen consequences. One disturbing scenario is that family members of ART funding and other family members later infected with HIV who cannot obtain treatment, and both developing a drug-resistant strain as a result. Another scenario is that of a mother of several children returning her medication because one or more children are being denied treatment and she cannot save her own life while watching them die. I have been further informed that this flat-lined PEPFAR funding for treatment is expanding to other countries and eventually will apply to our care and prevention programs as well. It is clear that the United States isn't likely to fund universal treatment and other HIV programming for exponentially growing numbers of patients in Africa. However, it is extremely important that any major changes, such as denial of treatment to those currently in PEPFAR care programs whose CD4 count falls below the level where ART becomes necessary, be pursued through a well-considered strategy. I will be interested to hear from the Deputy Assistant Administrator about whether and how such a strategy is being implemented, and any information he may have on how our partners are reacting to this growing crisis. I thank you, Mr. Chairman, again, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much. Ms. Woolsey, do you have an open statement?
No, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Royce.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd just like to mention that Ambassador Carson and I had a chance to participate in a bill signing ceremony yesterday at the White House with respect to the legislation on the Lord's Resistance Army. The President signed into law this particular act, the Lord's Resistance Army Disarmament and Northern Uganda Recovery Act. And that bill will task the administration with devising a strategy to put an end once and for all to Joseph Kony and to the Lord's Resistance Army and their use of terror and recruitment of child soldiers, indoctrination of those child soldiers, the rape and mayhem that they have spread across the continent of Africa. And of course, Ambassador Carson will be key in cobbling this strategy together. And I'm also appreciative of the strategy meeting afterwards at the old Executive Office building where, and the meeting with the NSC that Ambassador Carson helped arrange. I know that members of this committee look forward to working with Ambassador Carson on this strategy. I think implementation is key, and I think it's going to take congressional engagement here. This is a tragedy that has affected families throughout Uganda and Congo and the African Central Republic and Southern Sudan, and people in the United States may not all know the name Joseph Kony, but I guarantee you parents across Africa quiver when they hear that name. So I'm appreciative of that legislation being signed. Congressman Payne and I, some years ago, I had a resolution calling for Mobutu to stand down, calling for his replacement in Congo, and because of the legacy of corruption and malfeasance and mismanagement. And we did pass that legislation, and shortly thereafter, our CODEL I led was in Angola, and we found that frankly, Mobutu had flown had fled that morning, and so we took a small plane into Kinshasa, had a chance to meet, turned out not Congolese forces. The drivers that jumped into our Jeep, it turned out, were Rwandan. And they had, it was Rwandan and Ugandan forces that were there helping to install Laurent Kabila as the new leader of Congo. And since that time, Congo has had many challenges. And I think to repair the damage done to civil society there, which was never that strong, and certainly to the institutions, it's going to take increased engagement here by the United States House of Representatives. And I know Chairman Payne has made quite a commitment in that regard. I think that as we move forward, the first step is to set an example by the dismanagement, by taking apart the Lord's Resistance Army, by bringing to the bar of justice or eliminating Joseph Kony. And when we set up the institutions to help Africa accomplish that objective, we can move on to some of the other problems, such as the pillaging of minerals in eastern Congo, both from Zimbabwe and from Rwanda. And we need to lean in more heavily in terms of trying to force responsible behavior by the neighbors of the Congo. And again, I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing, and I thank Ambassador Carson for all of his work on the African continent back then and now in order to help guide that continent towards stability. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Royce, and thank you for all your years of interest in many of the achievements you've helped in Africa. Thank you. Ms. Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to welcome our witnesses and thank you so much for your service. Look forward to your testimony.
Dr. Bozeman. Ms. Watson.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to thank you for holding this timely hearing on U.S. policy on current conditions in the Great Lakes region. The international community has focused on this region, and yet there seems to be little improvement in the condition of the people. You've described much of it. The countries of the Great Lake region are linked by a common history and culture. Boundaries have done little to stymie the flow of people across the borders, oftentimes fleeing to perceive safety in a neighboring region. Each nation has a unique political story, which nonetheless affects not only its own citizens, but people all around the Great Lakes regions. However, strife and strikes are a common thread throughout. Human rights abuses are rampant, and though rape as a tool of submission remains prevalent throughout the Great Lakes region, the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo remains known for the high instances of rape of women and of children. The mineral conflict, too, rages on in the DRC, making it one of the longest and most violent wars in the history of mankind. There are even stories of child soldiers fighting in these battles already hyped and romanticized in popular films. And much of the youth in this region remained without jobs and susceptible to manipulation, leaving them easy prey for militant organizations. Democracy, too, is elusive. As we watch the preparation for elections in Rwanda and Burundi, I am unsure of how peaceful and fair the outcomes will be. Newspapers have been shut down. There are reports of violence occurring in Burundi already. With the constant instability, the condition of the people remains deplorable. Displaced by the Lord's Resistance Army, thousands of people are in need of humanitarian assistance in the DRC. Food and water shortages often occur, and health care is intermittent at best, and education services are limited for many. The President's initiatives are on food security, focused on food delivery at this time. PREPFAR and the President's Malaria Initiative cannot do enough because the need is too great. Nonetheless, great strides have been made already. Rwanda's MNC threshold program shows promise of increased stability in the region. The mineral conflict is beginning to be addressed effectively through the Kimberley process, though we still have a long way to go. The Great Lakes region is rich in terms of its people, its culture, its history, and its natural resources. And I hope that we continue to help the people in the region reach stability, protect individual rights, and maximize their potential. So I thank you, and I wait to hear from our distinguished witnesses, and I yield back the remainder of my time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Flake.
Glad to be here and look forward to the witnesses.
Mr. Miller.
Thank you, Chairman Payne and Ranking Member Smith, for holding this hearing. Mr. Royce and I created the Africa Great Lakes Caucus some time back to call more attention to the conflicts and challenges that this region faces. There's been a cycle of conflict and economic failure. Conflict begets extreme poverty begets conflict, and on and on. And in addition to the recurring, or as a result of the recurring conflict, there are now grave humanitarian conditions. Several members have already mentioned the brutal insurgency by the LRA in northern Uganda has displaced more than 1.5 million people, resulting in the abduction of at least 20,000 children. And that has gone on for more than 20 years in the Great Lakes region of Africa. The group continues to commit atrocities and abduct children across the region, often targeting schools and churches. The United Nations estimates that 90% of the LRA's combatants are abducted children, often as young as 10. When this horrific conflict finally ends, those children must somehow return to civilized society after learning as children to kill innocent human beings without hesitation or remorse. Whatever grievance may have originally motivated the LRA, that grievance has long since been forgotten, and the LRA's atrocities are just barbarism for barbarism's own sake. Unfortunately, in that respect, the LRA's insurgency is distressingly similar to other insurgencies in the area, in the region, where brutal kleptocratic regimes create ample justification for conflict, for rebellion, but the rebels frequently are not motivated by the desire to free their country of brutality and conflict, but by a desire to replace the brutal kleptocrats in the regime so the rebels can be brutal kleptocrats themselves. It makes it very hard for us to pick a side in the conflicts of the region. The DRC has the deadliest conflict since World War II. It continues to terrorize communities and throughout DRC, and all the conflicts spill over from one country into the next. DRC, after a generation or more of conflict, now has the second lowest gross national income in the world. I visited DRC a couple of years ago on a congressional delegation to Kinshasa. And Kinshasa appeared to be a post-apocalypse society. It appeared to be a road warrior movie in an urban setting. Rwanda has made great progress since the 1994 genocide, but genocide sets the bar pretty low. There are increasing efforts, apparently, to stifle political dissent. A New York Times article just last month described beggars, homeless people, petty thieves, and dozens of children being rounded up and sent without any legal process at all to an island for rehabilitation. Refugees, rebel groups, and resources flow across borders. The humanitarian crisis has increasingly become a regional challenge. Chairman Payne, again, thank you for holding this hearing, and I look forward to the testimony of our witnesses today.
Thank you very much, all of the members who took time to come here this morning. Now we'll turn to our witnesses first. We will hear from Ambassador Johnnie Carson. Ambassador Carson currently serves as Assistant Secretary of State for the Bureau of African Affairs at the Department of State. He has an established career in foreign service. He previously served as ambassador in Kenya, Zimbabwe, and Uganda, as well as the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of African Affairs from 1997 to 1999. In addition to several posts in sub-Saharan Africa, he served as desk officer in the Bureau of Intelligence and Research from 1971 to 74, staff officer for the Secretary of State from 78 to 82. Beyond the State Department, Ambassador Carson served as the staff director for the House Africa Subcommittee from 1979 to 1982, and was a Peace Corps volunteer in Tanzania from 1965 to 1968. During his career, Ambassador Carson received several awards, including the Department of State's Superior Honors Award and the Center for Disease Control's Champion of Prevention Award. Ambassador Carson holds a Bachelor of Arts in History and Political Science from Drake University and a Master's of Arts in International Relations from the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. Secondly, we will hear from Mr. Franklin Moore, Deputy Assistant Administrator for the Bureau of Africa at the United States International Development Agency, USAID. A career member of the Senior Executive Service, Franklin C. Moore was appointed as Deputy Assistant Administrator for the U.S. Agency for International Development's Africa Bureau in January 2008. Prior to his appointment, Mr. Moore served as Director of the Office of Environmental and Science Policy within the agency's Bureau for Economic Growth, Agriculture and Trade, EGAT, since October 2002. Additionally, Mr. Moore has served as the Acting Deputy Assistant Administrator and Director of the agency's Global Center for the Environment. He received a master's degree in agricultural economics as well as a certificate in African Studies from the University of Wisconsin in Madison. Mr. Moore studied for his PhD in Development Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's served and lived both in West and Southern Africa, and Mr. Moore has worked in approximately 40 countries overseas. So we're very pleased to have two very distinguished persons. I'd also, though, like to recognize a former colleague of ours, former Congressman Howard Whoopi, and I had the privilege to serve with former member Whoopi, who served as chair of this subcommittee when I was a new member, and is now a senior advisor on the Great Lakes region at the State Department. We're very pleased to still have your expertise, and I know you're a great asset to the Department of State. Thank you. Ambassador Carson.
Chairman Payne, Ranking Member Smith, and members of the committee. I welcome the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss the current conditions and U.S. policy in the Great Lakes region. I have a longer statement that I would like to submit for the record.
Without objection.
The countries of the Great Lakes region are inextricably linked. Although each has its own unique challenges, events in one country invariably affect the others, and often the wider region as well. We spend a great deal of diplomatic time and effort on the Great Lakes issues, trying to help the countries of the region to resolve the many domestic and cross-border challenges that continue to put millions of civilians at risk. This has been a slow and daunting process, but the situation has improved as the countries in the region have strengthened ties among themselves. We have remained dedicated to doing what we can to keep that positive momentum going. Central to our efforts is improving the situation in the eastern part of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where the continuing presence of armed groups has been exacerbated by the lack of state authority. The Democratic Republic of the Congo's military, commonly referred to as FARDC, is ineffective and frequently abusive. The judicial and penal systems in the DRC are broken, and impunity rather than accountability reigns. Illegal natural resource exploitation funds armed gangs. Sexual and gender-based violence is at crisis levels, particularly in the eastern region. The Lord's Resistance Army is perpetuating and perpetrating attacks against civilians in the northeastern Democratic Republic of the Congo and also in the Central African Republic. The UN mission in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, MONUC, is stretched to the limit. I met with President Kabila on April 16th and expressed concern about the security vacuum that would result if MONUC left the DRC before the security situation in the east had dramatically improved and before local security services were sufficiently trained and able to protect civilians. He was receptive to the concerns that I raised as well as the concerns that have been raised by the international community. President Kabila has taken important steps to address insecurity, but they remain insufficient. Last year, he announced a zero-tolerance policy for sexual and gender-based violence and also against corruption. Implementation has been lacking, but the recent arrest of a FARDC general for sexual and gender-based violence-related crimes is an encouraging step forward. Both Secretary Clinton and Ambassador Susan Rice from the UN have pressed for action on this case during their visits to the Congo in 2009. And we welcome the action by the President Kabila and his government to go after individuals of senior rank who have been involved in sexual and gender-based violence. President Kabila has also voiced strong support for our program to train a light infantry battalion in Kisangani. The training there includes a strong focus on improving FARDC human rights practices. In late 2009 and early 2010, we deployed assessment teams to the DRC to investigate the 5 issue areas that Secretary Clinton and President Kabila identified for greater bilateral cooperation when they met in August of 2009 in Goma. The 5 areas include security sector reform, sexual and gender-based violence issues, anti-corruption, economic governance, and agriculture and food security. We have received the recommendations of these teams and are now pursuing with the Democratic Republic of the Congo's government those recommendations that we believe can achieve the best short and medium-term results. We also need to keep an eye on population movements. There are over 1 million internally displaced persons in the North Kivu province alone, and 2 million displaced persons nationwide. As these IDPs and DRC refugees in surrounding countries begin to return home, there is a potential for renewed conflict. There will also be increased demands for humanitarian assistance and also limited capacity by the government of the Democratic Republic to provide it. Lastly, with regard to the DRC, we are looking ahead to national elections in September of 2011 and local elections a year later. In my conversations with President Kabila last month, I stressed the importance of adhering to this democratic electoral calendar. The government has promised that the elections will be free, democratic, and transparent. We hope that this will be the case. Let me turn briefly to Rwanda. In Rwanda, the August presidential elections are expected to be peaceful and nonviolent, but the security environment ahead of that vote is of ongoing concern. Recent grenade attacks in Kigali have caused numerous casualties, as well as anxiety and unease in the civilian population. We strongly condemn those attacks. We also have concerns about recent acts by the Rwandan government, which appear to be attempts to restrict freedom of expression. These actions, including suspending the licenses and activities of 2 newspapers, revoking the work permit of a Human Rights Watch researcher, and arresting and later releasing on bail the opposition leader Victoria Ingabire, who has ties to the FDLR. 2 political parties, the Green Party and the FDU Inkingi Party, have been unable to register. We have urged senior Rwandan government officials to respect the freedoms of expression, press and association, as well as assembly. We have stressed that the international and domestic NGOs and media should be allowed to operate and report freely in Rwanda. We have also called for due process and a fair and speedy trial for Mrs. Victoria Ingabire. Overall, long-term stability in Rwanda is best promoted by democratic governance and a respect for human rights. Rwanda and its regional and international partners must work together to achieve the free, fair, and peaceful elections that the people of Rwanda deserve. Now may I turn to Burundi. Our hope is the same in Burundi, which has just held the first in a series of 5 elections for local and national level institutions. We have undertaken numerous public and private efforts to reinforce the message that credible elections are necessary for long-term stability, economic growth, and the growing partnership between the government of Burundi and the United States. The political arena in Burundi is diverse. 23 political parties competed in yesterday's communal level elections, including the last of Burundi's rebel groups, the FNL. The party seems satisfied with the neutrality of the National Independent Electoral Commission, CINI. The media are relatively free and professional and have mobilized to pool resources and share their national electoral coverage. Burundian civil society has mobilized to observe the elections and to honor and to monitor outbreaks of violence. And all political parties, including the ruling party, have welcomed international observation. Unfortunately, Burundi also suffers from a large population of young, unemployed people who are frustrated with their economic position. Given that there are 200,000 weapons still in circulation throughout the country, the risk of violence continues to be high. In addition, ruling party officials have used government resources for political advantage, and some have intimidated opponents. There have already been violent clashes among the members of the 5 major parties. Most alarming, 2 members of the Movement for Solidarity and Democracy Party were killed in a rally on May 13th. We have repeatedly cautioned all political party leaders about the need to avoid intimidation, provocation, and violence. We have called on the government security forces and prosecutors to accelerate the investigations and prosecutions of those responsible for election-related incidents of violence and intimidation. The government of Burundi's decision to expel a Human Rights Watch researcher on the grounds that a recent Human Rights Watch report is biased against the ruling party appears to be an effort to clamp down on foreign and domestic NGOs that are critical of the government and its policies. We have conveyed our concerns to Burundian officials about this and have urged constructive dialogue with NGOs and civil society. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I want to thank you for this opportunity to appear before you today, and I will be happy to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Moore.
Good morning, Chairman Payne, Ranking Member Smith, and members of the subcommittee. I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss current conditions in the Great Lakes region and USAID's contribution to sustainable development in those countries. I have a longer written statement which I would like to submit for the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. My testimony today will add to that of Assistant Secretary Carson's, who has provided the subcommittee with information on the U.S. government policies in the region. Our work directly supports those policies and focuses on a number of sectors, including economic growth, peace building, democratic development, health, education, food security, and environmental protection. We also continue to respond to both man-made and natural humanitarian crises in many of these states. While significant progress has been made across the region, equally significant challenges persist. Corruption, poor infrastructure, cross-border conflicts, sexual and gender-based violence, and human rights abuses, poor health outcomes, high unemployment, humanitarian crises, and food insecurity. National issues frequently spill across borders to become regional concerns and crises. I'd like to briefly outline some of these key issues and USAID's response. One of the most pressing issues that will affect development in the Great Lakes in the coming year is rapid population growth. This will strain the abilities of already stretched governments to provide service delivery and sustainable economic growth. And increasingly, young populations present an increased risk for instability and conflict. USAID programs across the sectors target youth in order to boost civic participation, improve livelihoods, and increase access to education to provide an alternative to confrontation and violence. The recruitment of child soldiers also remains a critical concern for youth population, particularly the lasting damage caused. Another issue for the region is the abhorrent presence of sexual and gender-based violence, both as a tool of war and as part of the daily lives of women and children throughout the region. In addition to addressing the immediate care and needs of victims of sexual and gender-based violence, USAID has actively supported the drafting of critical legislation and subsequent prosecutions in cases of sexual and gender-based violence in the DRC. And we continue to seek opportunities to address this issue at all levels. Combating this issue is not solely about broadening access to legal, medical, psychosocial, and economic services. It integrally tied to changing perceptions of gender and women's empowerment. Food security is of paramount concern. In the DRC, 72% of the population is currently undernourished and surviving on less than the absolute minimum daily caloric requirement. This administration's Feed the Future initiative will boost production to attempt to meet the food needs for the growing population of these states. Recognizing that higher production does not automatically translate directly into a better quality of life, activities to address nutrition and governance issues related to distribution and regulation are critical and included. Activities will focus on linkages to the regionally strong and very active Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa and Economic Commission for Africa to ensure that there is a sustainable platform for trade. Land tenure issues also continue to be an underlying source of many of the region's conflicts. With high population densities, internally displaced persons, and the return of refugees in Rwanda, Burundi, Eastern DRC, and Uganda, the question of land distribution and access is critical to economic growth. USAID is working on programs in Burundi to inclusively develop new land policy in order to reduce the risk of conflict. There are mounting tensions over land tenure and property rights in Eastern DRC. USAID is addressing these issues through peace-building and community mediation programs, as well as working with the government of DRC to address the overall legal framework for land tenure. In Uganda, we have launched an interagency conflict assessment to look at the sensitive issues of decentralization, proposed relocation of pastoralist communities to urban centers, and the discovery of oil. We believe that we are in a new era for development in Africa, focused on aid effectiveness and host country ownership that will translate into meaningful progress towards the Millennium Development Goals. We are aligning our work to more directly support harmonization of aid strategies, results-based programs, and mutual accountability between donors and aid recipients. Our work in the Great Lakes is coordinated with both host country action plans on a sectorial basis and with broad-reaching poverty reduction strategies. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Smith, and members of the subcommittee for your continued support for USAID. I welcome your questions.
Well, thank you very much. We certainly appreciate both of your testimonies. And I might just begin by asking Ambassador Carson, you mentioned that you had a conversation with President Kabila in regard to his strategy to have the MONUC forces reduced. What was the rationale for his wanting initially to see them reduced, and what and where does it stand at the present time?
Mr. Chairman, thank you for that question. Indeed, I did have an opportunity to talk with President Kabila about the presence of the MONUC forces there. I think that we have to remember that this year is the 50th anniversary of the Congo's independence. And I think that President Kabila wanted to demonstrate that after 50 years of independence, in which there has been an almost continuous presence of UN peacekeepers there, that the country could move ahead and begin to do without United Nations peacekeeping forces. I think he was intent on making a statement at the anniversary that there would be a withdrawal of UN peacekeeping forces. So I think it had a lot to do with domestic politics, the country's political pride, the long-standing presence of UN peacekeepers there, and the desire to show after 50 years that the Congo no longer needed to rely on peacekeepers. I must say that President Kabila demonstrated flexibility in the discussions about this, and I think is now increasingly aware of the continued need for UN peacekeepers in the eastern part of the Congo. I took the opportunity to stress to President Kabila that as long as there was widespread instability in the eastern Congo, the presence of rebel groups that had not been contained, while there was a high level of sexual and gender-based violence, that there was a need for a presence of UN forces. But as I said, the President Kabila is showing increasing flexibility on this issue, and we hope that it will be resolved in the UN Security Council to the satisfaction of the Council, as well as to the satisfaction of the government of the Congo.
Thank you very much. Mr. Moore, since the whole Congo Basin region is so, the Great Lakes region is so fertile, are there any agricultural programs that I know you touched on a little bit, but what are we doing to try to encourage Great Lakes countries to take a stronger look at agriculture in general?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In the President's initiative on Feed the Future, 2 of the targeted countries, or 3 of the targeted countries, if one goes just a little beyond the Great Lakes, include Ethiopia. It includes Uganda within the Great Lakes. It also includes Kenya. As Ambassador Carson pointed out, one of the 5 assessments that was made in DRC was a food security assessment. And so their food security and agriculture portfolio is also being heightened. That is looking particularly at the production side. On the other side, there is a desire to make sure that increasingly food and agricultural produce is able to move across borders more quickly and more efficiently. And for that work, as I said in my testimony, we are working primarily with CUMESA, who is looking at both the concept of one border stops, so that 2 countries would adhere to the same standards, and that would allow food to move across their borders, much like food moves across the borders of our states here in the United States, as well as looking at transportation corridors and working increasingly with the Millennium Challenge Corporation in those places where they have engaged in programs to provide them and the countries with some information that might help to mitigate transportation problems.
Thank you. My last question, since my time has expired, but Ambassador Carson, I've previously raised the question of Rwandan genocide suspects who are living in the United States of America. I could currently give you a list of 5 persons who are still here. but two in particular, Mr. Zahira Barry, right? And one who was actually in my home state teaching at a university, Montclair State, Dr. Menu Kasi, who then left the state after I raised some questions with the university there, but came down to teach again at Tolson State University. There's evidence he escaped from prison in Rwanda. There's a warrant out for his extradition, and he continues to be able to live here in the United States. I wonder if there's any information you have regarding at least the case of from the professor who's still in education here in the U.S.
Mr. Chairman, I don't have any specifics about that particular case, but I would like to say that the United States remains committed to doing everything that it possibly can as a part of the international community to bring to justice those individuals who were most responsible for the perpetration of the genocide that occurred in Rwanda in 1994. The United States has had a Rewards for Justice program that has been effective in helping to track down genocidaires around the world, and some of our people in our embassies, our legal acts, and others have helped to do so. You probably are aware, with respect to individuals in this country, that we, do not have an extradition treaty with the government of Rwanda, but that does not, in fact, inhibit us from looking at individuals who have come into the United States under false pretenses, having violated our immigration laws. We also look at individuals who we believe to be involved in crimes that are also against other statutes of the United States laws. We will look at these individuals. We will refer the names to our legal office and also to the Department of Justice, and we will continue to follow up on any individuals who we believe to be involved in the past genocide in Rwanda.
Thank you very much. We will certainly, like I said, give you all the information that we have. We are very particular, as my colleague, Mr. Smith, was a different type of a case, but a young child whose parents was here in the United States and tried for years and years to finally have that child come back to this country. And we were criticizing the laws of Brazil for not allowing this to happen more quickly. And here in a situation where Rwanda is asking us to cooperate with them, we can't have it both ways. We can't ask other countries around the world to cooperate with us, and then we don't cooperate with other countries. And so I certainly will follow up with you on that, Mr. Secretary. Mr. Smith.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me just ask, I think, Mr. Moore, you'd be the one that might want to answer this. The CDC letter that pointed out that in Uganda, approximately 100,000 HIV-affected individuals had gotten ARV interventions from the U.S. government, funded by our government. And yet the letter said that the U.S. government recognizes in the coming years the number of patients in need of antiretroviral treatment will increase dramatically, and that the scale up, basically the letter said there's a moratorium put on new patients being signed up, and that the government is being encouraged to find additional funding to meet this great need. And I'm wondering what has been the impact of this new policy on people who are sick? Have people died as a result of this unmet need not being adequately met by either ourselves or in collaboration with our partners in Europe and elsewhere? And because to me, this is this is a banner issue, the fact that we have raised expectations, and it would appear we're not about to meet those expectations.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Unfortunately, I'll have to get back to you on that. Here is the reason. Last week, the U.S. government, all of the U.S. government, CDC, USAID, Peace Corps, and all of those who are implementing PEPFAR had their annual meeting in Arusha, Tanzania. And this was one of the major subjects that they took up. Unfortunately for us, our staff who participated in the meeting, since they were on the continent, went off to visit some of the countries concerned and are just beginning to get back. But I will pose this question to them, and we will get you something, I believe.
If you would, you know, one of the things that all of us recognize when the original PEPFAR legislation was passed and then when it was reauthorized is that we need to keep faith with those who are sick and dying in Africa and anywhere else where the ARV can not only extend their life but give them a quality of life. There is a broad consensus in Congress that every dollar we spent in helping people with this dreaded disease is money well spent. So frankly, I remain shocked that without advising, I don't know if the chairman was advised, but I certainly wasn't advised except by some of the partners who got this infamous letter saying put a moratorium on any new patients that you might sign up. And as I said in my opening, this could have very severe negative consequences even within families themselves as decisions are made as to who gets what, and if new enrollees are being blocked, it seems to me that individuals who are currently getting might take themselves off of it. So it's a very serious issue. You know, ask us if you need more money. Secondly, let me ask on the, and I've asked this several times, the OIOS investigators for Manuk. I met with the top, he was a member of the Royal Police from Canada, who headed up the OIOS mission in Goma, and he was shocked beyond words that there would be a redeployment. This was a couple of years ago. That redeployment of those investigators has taken place. How do you monitor something from so many miles away? Yeah, there's some people that could alert the OIOS folks, but it seems to me you need a very significant deployment rather than decreasing it. And let me also ask you, if I could, you mentioned, Ambassador Carson, with mild, how'd you put it, mildly encouraged, that the President Kabila had announced a zero-tolerance policy, which I think is a good thing, obviously, regarding gender-based violence, but also that they had arrested a general. Could you elaborate on who that general was, what he has been accused of, and most importantly, because we've learned this, and I know the chairman knows this as well, from all of our trafficking work, an arrest does not a prosecution make. What is being done with the prosecution, and whether or not, you know, how far along is that? And finally, I do have many questions, but time is of the essence, I guess. When you talked about drafting legislation, which sounds like a very good thing, could you provide the committee with exactly what it is we're drafting, what kind of legislation we are collaborating with each of these countries? And also, I chaired a briefing a couple of weeks ago on the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation's blockbuster study on maternal mortality. And it was carried in the Lancet in early April. I've read the study. It is a very well-controlled study. And the Gates Foundation found that the number of women dying of maternal mortality is significantly less than what WHO and others had advertised, which is good news. It's great news. But they also said that the reasons why, the mitigating factors for maternal mortality include such things as having a skilled birth attendant available so that if there is an obstructed delivery, a cesarean section can be had so that both mother and baby are allowed to live rather than dying a terrible, terrible death. Nowhere in Lancet or in the article did it mention abortion as in any way a factor. I think it is one of the most misconceived ideas that somehow killing an unborn child averts or brings down maternal mortality, and it wasn't in the study, I'm happy to say. But if you could speak to the issue of what are we doing to build up, train up skilled birth attendants, because that is the answer, it would seem to me, and it now has been further authenticated by the Gates Foundation and by the Lancet publication of that foundation study.
Congressman Smith, you addressed two questions that I think I should answer. The first one pertains to the OIOS, which is in fact the Office of Internal Oversight Services of the United Nations. This organization, as you and other members are probably aware, is set up to look over the conduct of UN peacekeepers in the field. The U.S. position with respect to OIOS is clear. We believe that UN peacekeepers should be held to the highest legal and humanitarian standards in carrying out their responsibilities and obligations overseas. And we think that it is important that the OIOS, in fact, be present to do their work. There are currently 3 OIOS positions based in the eastern part of the Congo in Goma. 2 of those individuals are investigators, and 1 is a senior support staff member. In addition, there are no less than 10 OIOS officers and staff based in Kinshasa. But there are indeed 22 OIOS investigators assigned to the regional hub in Nairobi, Kenya. And I think it is the deployment of those 22 investigators that your question pertains to. The reality is that the UN has moved those individuals to Nairobi as a part of a pilot effort in order to be able to save some money and resources. But the other side of the reality is that it is actually easier to move from Nairobi to Goma on most days than it is to move from Kinshasa to Goma, given the limited transportation arrangements. We have looked at this issue, are waiting for the UN to determine whether this pilot will work effectively, but our central concern remains, and that is that those individuals who are part of the UN peacekeeping forces who do undertake illegal activities should be investigated and prosecuted, and that the OIOS should do this wherever they are centrally based, whether it is Kinshasa or whether it is Nairobi or whether there are people on the ground in Goma. You also asked about the recent arrest of a senior Congolese general. And I'm going to butcher the name because I think the name is General Kwangera, but I'll get you the correct name. Last year, in 2009, when Secretary Clinton met with President Kabila in Goma, she reiterated a message that had been conveyed earlier by UN Ambassador Susan Rice about 5 senior Congolese military officers who had been accused of sexual and gender-based violence. These individuals have been known as the FARDC 5. The general who was arrested was the highest ranking of those individuals. 3 of the FARDC 5 are now under government investigation. The general has been arrested Two other individuals who were colonels have been relieved of their responsibilities and under detention / house arrest in Kinshasa, but not carrying out in military activities at all. And two of the other individuals have fled and we believe have left the country, certainly at least one. We have continued to press President Kabila to take action at all levels against officers as well as enlisted individuals in the military who have been involved in sexual and gender-based violence. We believe, again, that this is a step forward. But I want to underscore that given the high level of sexual and gender-based violence, the high level of violence that exists in the Eastern Congo, these are very, very small steps. And they need to be magnified, not in terms of 5 or 10, but in terms of 100 and 1,000 times. There is, in fact, far too much gender-based violence in the East, and there should be no impunity for those who carry it out, whatever their rank. This is a step forward. We encourage President Kabila to live up to all of his commitments in this area. It is not enough simply to say, I support I support zero tolerance. It must be made to be fact, and that can only be demonstrated by arrests, by prosecutions, and imprisonment.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Smith.
Oh.
The two pieces that you asked for me, I spoke to critical legislation as it relates to sexual and gender-based violence in DRC, and we'll get you a full list, but it falls basically into two areas. The first area is the fact that there are still on the books many discriminatory laws that sanction a lower status for women in DRC. For example, women can't open a bank account or file a case in court without their husband's approval. Also, in many cases, women are not permitted to actually own land in their name. So one of the areas is looking at getting some of these laws off of the books and creating some laws that empower women, such as the land tenure that I speak of. The other area is there's a little work being done with the judiciary, given that the judiciary continues to suffer from a lack of independence. The other area that you asked about was maternal mortality and birth attendance. I believe that this is one of the justifications and reasons for the President's Global Health Initiative. And that Global Health Initiative is intended so that many of the areas of health, like maternal health, which, given our emergency look at HIV/AIDS, our emergency look at malaria, in the short term suffered because many of the women who would be women as birth attendants moved into these areas of care. So one of the ideas of the Global Health Initiative is to help to rebalance that care in the health field so that it covers such things as maternal mortality, birthing, et cetera, et cetera. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Watson.
I want to shift the questioning a bit to Mr. Ambassador Carson. In your testimony, you mentioned the political environments in Burundi and Rwanda, and both nations are quickly approaching elections that we hope will be fair and peaceful. Yet there are 200,000 weapons in Burundi, and most of the over 25-year-old population is unemployed and frustrated. And there have been violent clashes among the 5 ruling parties. The government Burundi's decision to expel a Human Rights Watch researcher is also very disturbing. And Rwanda, similarly, has recently suspended 2 newspapers, prevented some political parties from registering for the election, also denied the visa to a human rights researcher. The question is, in the face of such adversity, what kind of elections can we really expect, and what can be done to reduce the violence before or after the elections, and will any election results hold legitimacy with the public?
I think that both of these countries have had very, very traumatic histories in which they have faced great adversity and civil unrest. And they are both coming out of long periods of adversity. I think that we have worked with and encouraged both governments to hold elections that are creditable and fair, that they should in fact open up political space for the opposition, that they should allow civil society to participate, and we continue to encourage them to move in a positive direction. We think that despite the violence that we have seen in Burundi, that progress is being made in that country, and that it is coming back from a long period of greater instability. In Rwanda, we continue to encourage the government to build on the progress that it has made since the genocide of 1994, and not to begin to stall its political process or to allow it to move back.
Let me ask you if, do we get the international election observation groups like the Carter Center involved prior to these elections? We know they will come in, these international organizations, during an election as observers. I've been part of that group from time to time. What are we doing prior to help them know how to run good and effective elections?
Let me say, in Burundi, we have been extremely active in helping the government improve the climate for multi-party activities. We have worked via, not only via the Carter Center, but also the Wilson Center, and also the Woodrow Wilson Center, but also the National Democratic Institute. All have been engaged and involved on the ground. And
is that ongoing?
These are ongoing. We also, ourselves in the Department of State, have a robust democracy and governance program that we fund to help support elections, and we have contributed a substantial amount to the government to help ensure that the elections are run and run freely and fairly. So we are engaged, and we are actively monitoring the situation in Burundi and also in Rwanda.
I was stunned. Which one of the countries has 23 parties?
That's Burundi.
How does that work?
It is, in fact, democracy at its best.
I'll have to look at that more. Let me move on to Ambassador Moore.
Lots of public participation.
Exactly. Everyone in the public is in a party in the legislature. Okay, Ambassador Moore, your testimony noted that Rwanda has made extraordinary progress to improve the economic, health, and social well-being of its people relative to its neighbors. And the MCC just recently signed a threshold program to improve its progress. And yet, in light of the coming elections, newspapers have been closed, and political parties are unable to register. And Rwandans that fled during the genocide are said to be returning to the nation, especially as the situation in the DRC worsens. So what is the situation currently between the Hutu and the Tutsi? And are there any of them returning, and with what frequency? And will this return affect the relationship between the Hutu and the Tutsi? And I am also glad to hear of the MCC's threshold program in Rwanda, and so can you expand on that? And what is the USAID's role in all of this? So,
Thank you, ma'am. Let me see if I can sort of systematically try to answer your question.
Yeah.
I do believe that there is a continued return of displaced persons to Rwanda. A part of that is push from the places they currently are living as conditions deteriorate, but part of that is a pull from Rwanda from the economic success. I think you contrasted some of the things that may be viewed as economic success with some of the things that may be viewed as political lack of success. But on the economic side, there has been a lot of success in Rwanda, and it has attracted people back. Does that create problems? Yes, it does create problems. Rwanda is an area that has a very high population density. As one attracts people back to the country, it creates issues of land tenure, land ownership, who has rights to use what land. They have been, in some areas, very successful at integrating those populations. I would say from my visits there, I certainly haven't noticed that that contributes to an increased ethnic tension. It has, in some ways, caused them to do their economic business in some different ways. For example, they have moved from pastoralists who are wandering pastoralists towards a more settled form of both milk production and meat production, and converted some of their farms into growing traditional grasses for cows so that they can produce dairy by holding the cow in a pen rather than allowing the cow to wander. Let me see.
Yeah, that's all right.
I think I've covered
Yeah,
sort
you've
of
given us overview, and
the highlights.
my time is up. I just, if I may, Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to go back to Ambassador Carson, and you mentioned the funding that comes out of State Department for these election activities. Do we fund you adequately enough to do this tremendous job you're trying to do in that area of the world? I'm just...
Democracy and governance in Africa is President Obama's principal foreign policy objective and priority in and across the continent. He said as such in his speech in Accra, Ghana in July of last year when he spoke before the Parliament. Additional monies and resources to fund the #1 priority are always useful. We can never spend enough on helping to strengthen the principles of good governance, which are fundamental to both our human rights protection as well as the strength of economies.
Well, I just want to say, Mr. Chairman, that I think our monies that we give and donate to these countries could be well used rather than our monies that we put into fighting wars that have no end to them. And the $15 billion we put in a month to Iraq, to me, was wasted money, and we lost lives too. And I'd like to see us, we have a difficult time with budgeting, as you know, with these deficits, but I can see these countries through the efforts, through the State Department, your efforts, making progress. It might seem small, but it is. And you know, they can use the money we give more effectively than we do. And the USAID is an example of, finding ways and giving money to NGOs, because I think they do a better job. But anyway, I would hope that we can have some concentration on funding the activities in these countries, because I think the continent of Africa is the resource we're going to be looking towards in the next 10 years, right now, in terms of supplying our needs here in this country too, and helping to settle and stabilize that continent will help us in other areas of the world. So thank you very much, and I'm sorry to use so much time, but I think these are important statements we need to make with these very informed experts here. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Congresswoman. Mr. Royce?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was going to ask a question of Ambassador Carson, and it relates to the referendum on independence of Southern Sudan. That's looming, I think, January of next year. And I think the worry for a lot of people that have looked at this is that unless the LRA is permanently dealt with now, that given the ties reportedly that they've had in the past in terms of both munitions that they've received, training, and then especially recently sending some of their officers up to Khartoum to be patched up, the worry is that Khartoum might put that killing squad to work, if things went from bad to worse in South Sudan. So I was going to ask you about my concerns on that.
Congressman Royce, thank you. Let me first of all say that we are committed to the full implementation of the comprehensive peace agreement that was signed in Naivasha, Kenya, back in January of 2005. And the key component of that agreement is the opportunity for the people of Southern Sudan to participate in a referendum which should be held in January 2011 to determine whether they want to remain as a part of a united Sudan or a part of an independent Southern Sudan. We think it is important that that comprehensive peace agreement be fully implemented and that the will of the Southern Sudanese be allowed to take expression. With respect to the LRA, we are deeply concerned about the continued activities of Joseph Kony and the LRA. They have moved out of Uganda into the northeastern part of the Congo, into the area around the Garamba Forest, and have occasionally foraged further north into the Central African Republic and also into parts of the southern Sudan. We have committed ourselves to being of assistance to the Ugandan government as they have attempted to track down one of the most violent killers in Africa. And we remain supportive of Ugandan efforts, consistent with the Ugandan government securing the permission of neighboring states to have their troops operate across borders.
Very good. Well, let me also ask you about two other issues. One, Ethiopia, and the other, Rwanda, where I think we need to lean in. Millis, President Millis, after the 2005 election, in which the opposition did too well for his liking, began a process where political opponents and local journalists were often jailed. Foreign journalists were denied visas. The government there jams our VOA broadcasts, despite the fact that they received nearly $1 billion of aid. The State Department reports that the Ethiopian security services commit politically motivated killings. So the Millis government has the repression thing down pretty good. As I've said before, the only thing only brutal Eritrea next door makes Ethiopia look good. And there was a piece in the New York Times in which there was a comment by a dissident, but basically the government there is committed to revolutionary democracy. And that's a collectivism that tolerates no dissent. And the New York Times quotes this prominent Ethiopian dissident saying, they still have this leftist ideology that the vanguard party is right for the people. Well, they always will. And we need to lean in hard. We've got to speak out more about the human rights violations that occur there. Otherwise, these elections become a charade. On Rwanda, I thought you put it well in your paper. You said in a period of months, the government of Rwanda has suspended 2 newspapers, revoked the work permit, and denied the visa of a Human Rights Watch researcher, and arrested and subsequently released on bail an opposition leader. Well, Paul Rusesabagina wrote in the Wall Street Journal the other day, warning signs are everywhere. So, and then we have the problem that Rwanda continues in the eastern Congo, as Human Rights Watch reported that the Rwandan government has backed Congolese rebel groups willing to fight the Hutu militias. Since 1996, Rwanda has backed 3 different Congolese rebel groups and sometimes other splinter groups who agree to fight the Rwanda Hutu militias. But here's the other part of that, the real difficulty of it. Those same groups also seek the overthrow of the government in Kinshasa. So you mentioned that you're stepping up your engagement on conflict minerals. That's, of course, another problem there with respect to the extraction that the Rwandans are doing in eastern Congo. It's a good place to start, but how do we bring additional pressure and muscle to bear here, both on Ethiopia and on Rwanda, so that in the future there are elections there in which people actually have an opportunity to bring about the rule of law, and you don't have a continuance of the problems that I see Mr. Wolpe here. You know, we appreciate your engagement, special envoy, but to try to solve these problems, if civil society really sees a hopeful future where everyone has a place and there is freedom of speech and there is the ability of upward mobility because you have a more open society, there's a better chance of resolving conflicts. Ambassador?
Congressman Royce, we do a number of things in both Rwanda and also Ethiopia, but across the continent with respect to issues of democracy and governance. We engage with senior government officials, encouraging them to strengthen their democratic institutions, to provide for freedom of the press, provide for greater opportunities for civil society, improvement of independent electoral commissions so that when elections are held, people will have confidence that they have credibility. We encourage groups like NDI, NED, IRI, the Carter Center to become engaged in democracy-building programs. We encourage the growth of civil society at all levels so that they can become more active in terms of their participation as well as in their ability to audit and review government activities. We work with our diplomatic colleagues from other democracies and encourage them to engage with governments.
We do that,
we speak out aggressively.
Well, we should shout from the rooftops if we're giving $1 billion to Ethiopia, and simultaneously they're jamming our VOA broadcasts. I can't even imagine what would be so objectionable in Ethiopia that they've got to jam the broadcasts. I think at the end of the day, these corrupt elections that in countries that receive so much largesse, that receive so much support from the United States, I agree on the engagement, and I know how much you are engaged, but sometimes we've just got to bellow, we've just got to shout, because otherwise, how are we going to change the dynamics in Ethiopia to make sure, you know, once all of the newspapers, beyond that, once all the reporters have been jailed and the opposition are either jailed or intimidated that if you join the opposition, you might be. Then add to that the VOA broadcast can't even come into the country. How are people going to get news and information?
Let me just speak to a couple of those points, and you talk
Yeah.
about shouting very clearly.
Right.
I will send you, Mr. Congressman Royce, the letter that was sent from the State Department to Prime Minister Mellish about the issue of jamming VOA.
Good.
It was, in fact, very strong, it was very clear, and it was very forceful. We note in the world that there are probably only 4 or 5 nations that attempt to jam VOA today. And I think that Ethiopia does not want to be included amongst them. And of course, those are nations such as Cuba and North Korea.
Yes.
We appreciate the level of collaboration that we receive from Ethiopia in a number of areas. But we also believe that Ethiopia must do better in strengthening its democratic institutions. Ethiopia went to the polls on Sunday, just a couple of days ago. And while the elections were calm and peaceful and largely without any kind of violence, we note with some degree of remorse that the elections there were not up to international standards. We note that over the last year and a half to 18 months, that the government has taken clear and decisive steps that would ensure that it would garner an electoral victory. And that is indeed what has happened, because the level of opposition representation that appears to have won seats in the legislative branch of the Ethiopian government has dropped quite significantly. It is important that Ethiopia move forward in strengthening its democratic institutions, and when elections are held, that it level the playing field to give everyone a free opportunity to participate without fear or favor.
I appreciate that, Ambassador. The international community has been speaking out about this election not being credible, and I also appreciate your words as well. And thank you very, very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It is apparent from private conversations, if not from public statements, that some of the international community's earlier enthusiasm for the Museveni government in Uganda has dimmed substantially and seems on a trajectory to dim much further. Both of you in your testimony apparently suggest that governments in this region should not be judged by how they compare to an ideal, but by whether they're getting better or getting worse. And it appears that on democratic governance issues, at least, Uganda is getting worse. Mr. Moore, you said in your testimony that USAID is expanding programs directly related to the 2011 elections, in the Ugandan elections, to support electoral process, assistance to parties, civil society, and obviously no civil society or no election is going to work very well without an independent media. There is now legislation pending in the Ugandan parliament to require annual licensing for all newspapers, and will allow the license to be revoked if the newspaper publishes anything prejudicial to national security, stability, or unity, amounts to economic sabotage, or is injurious to Uganda's relations with new neighbors or friendly countries. It is pretty hard to imagine that that kind of threat of revocation of a license would square with anything we would regard as freedom of the press or that it would serve the Ugandan people very well in preparing for an election to get the information that they need. Are both of you aware of this pending legislation? And what are the implications for democratic governance in Uganda? And are there other signs of democratic decline in Uganda leading up to the February elections?
Congressman Miller, I'm aware of the legislation. I think that it is not very thoughtful legislation. The Ugandan media has spoken out against it. Even the government-owned New Vision newspaper, which is the most widely read and most widely circulated paper in the country, has also editorialized against this media legislation as well. I am sure that our embassy has also weighed in and made their views known to members of the government there about what they think of this legislation. But let me just say in general terms about Uganda and the issue of democratization. It is important that Uganda not move backwards, that it not stall, but continue to move forward in strengthening its democratic institutions. Last Thursday, I had an opportunity to make a very quick trip to Uganda, and I had an opportunity to speak with the president of the country, as well as with several senior ministers in that country. And while the nature of my visit had to do with broader foreign policy issues, I specifically raised the issue of democratization and the strengthening of democratic institutions with the president. I can say this very clearly because if you had a copy of the New Vision, you would see that for the 2 days that I was in country, on both days there were widely reported stories of why I was coming to Uganda and what the response was. But I spoke to the president and senior ministers, among other things, about making the election commission more broadly representative of society in general, and making it more creditable. I also spoke to him about the registration process and the need to ensure that all Ugandans had an opportunity to be registered and to be able to participate in next year's vote. The discussions were wide-ranging, and in most instances, when I am traveling around the continent, I will talk very clearly to leaders about the need to strengthen their democratic institutions. This is important for us, but it is even more important for African countries and the stability and growth of their democracies. As I said earlier, it is a major priority of the administration to continue to encourage democratic progress and to do so in a manner that benefits all the people and not just a few.
Okay. Mr. Moore, you have spoken in your testimony several times of land reform, tenure security, property rights. Obviously, it leads to conflict, as you have said. It certainly can lead to great injustice, but it also makes economic development almost impossible for there to be no tenure security. No one is going to invest in improving land if the land may be taken from them arbitrarily, and if their improvements make it more likely that it will be taken from them arbitrarily. I've introduced legislation that I hope becomes part of the foreign assistance reauthorization to focus more on rapid urbanization and tenure security. But could you describe for us, you've mentioned it, but in more detail, what we're doing in DRC, in Rwanda, and Burundi to encourage land tenure property right reform.
Thank you, Congressman. It's an area that is an emerging area of concern for the agency, not just in the countries you've mentioned, but pretty wide-ranging in Africa, including Liberia and a variety of other places. What are we doing? To date, we generally have had one full-time land tenure expert. That is moving to a land tenure team. We are, as an agency, I think, recruiting an additional 4 other members for that team. They currently spend, the current person spends about 60% of his time in Africa. We, the Africa Bureau, are bringing on a full-time land tenure person who will work with the existing expert. And what we're doing is working both with agriculture ministries, land ministries where they exist, to ascertain what really are the tenure rules of the country, and in particular, where there are traditional tenure rules and there are modern legal rules, trying to resolve the differences between those so that countries can move forward with one system of land tenure that provides secure tenure for its citizens. In particular, one of the things we're looking at is the role of women in land tenure. We know that women make up 70% of the agricultural force, and often they are reduced to agricultural labor because they don't have control of that land. So that's one of the things in particular we're looking at in land tenure.
Okay. Mr. Moore, I understand how important it is in agricultural areas. It is also important in urban settings. In the slums of the rapidly urbanizing cities of Africa, the absolute lack of any kind of tenure makes it almost impossible that housing will be anything more than a shack without water or sewer or electricity or anything else. Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Woolsey?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for keeping this going long enough for me to leave and come back. Appreciate you. Mr. Moore, in your testimony, you said that gender and women's empowerment is very important, and in your written testimony, you noted that the lifetime risk of maternal death ranges from 1 in 13 in DRC and 1 in 25 in Uganda. So with the resources that the United States and the international community have dedicated to reduce maternal mortality, why are these numbers so high, and what about our current policies and practices, or the region's current policies and practices, need to be changed to improve these numbers so that we can, and what are the biggest challenges to making real changes for women throughout the region?
Thank you, ma'am. I may have touched on this a bit while you were out. That's all right. I think that one of the things, quite honestly, as I said earlier, is that there were a variety of health issues that we looked at as emergencies. And as we looked at those as emergencies, we tended to move away from systematic care to deal with particular diseases or particular health concerns. And one of the focuses of the President's health initiative is that we would more comprehensively focus on health systems. And that comprehensive focus on health systems allows us, I think, to help to engage in a broader range of technical experts, including birthing assistants, and to allow women, particularly pregnant women, to have a system that responds more broadly to their needs. I think if you look historically at maternal and child health, it sort of dipped and then went up, I think, as we looked more at individual diseases in emergency settings, and I think the desire is to look more comprehensively so that that begins to dip again.
Well, I think that's a great idea, because unless we level the playing field. I don't want to take anything away from malaria and AIDS, HIV/AIDS, or any of those programs, but I would like maternal mortality to have that same level of support and interest. On another subject, it's both of you. It is so clear that it's the women and children who suffer at the hands of a bunch of dudes, not just in developing nations, but really all over the world. But the more educated a area is, or a region, or a country, the more civilized it usually is. So and then you said that the youth population, like in Burundi, under 50% of the population is under 25. How are we educating these youth so that they will then become adults who care about each other and not just about competing and ending up with women and children being the brunt of the whole program? So education, how are we educating?
Let me make a few remarks on that. As you are aware, the United States is one of the traditional leaders, particularly in basic education and increasingly in higher education. One of the things that we talk about and debate quite a bit is the missing aspects of vocational education, which should be targeted at, in particular, youth bulges, and we have a number of countries that have huge youth bulges. And in those settings, we have a number of employers who complain that they are not able to find people who have the particular skills that they need for employment. One of the big areas, for example, one would find is with hotel workers or the hospitality field, where they feel that some targeted education might be useful in helping those youth to acquire the type of skills that are needed so that they can enter the hospitality area. We've just begun under our new administrator to look at some of the ways we might be able to respond to some of these needs, and to look particularly at some new partners in the United States that may be useful in responding there. One of the things that comes to mind is that for many of the areas where there has been an expressed desire by employers, and we might be able to have some public-private partnerships, are the training of things that in the United States are actually trained by what we would refer to as community colleges or junior colleges. So that's one of the areas that I think increasingly, as we look at the needs for youth bulge, particularly as it relates to employment, that we're going to have to engage in education.
But what about the challenge that schools are, quote, free, but it's the cost of the monthly fee that the parents can't scrape up so that their kids don't go to school half the time? I mean, these are little kids, and they can't go into vocational education if we haven't trained them. I mean, they haven't had any education.
That's an issue. I'm not sure I have an immediate answer for you on that.
Well, I think it needs to be addressed, and something I read just this weekend, I can't even remember what paper I read, so many of them, about families spending more money on tobacco and liquor than they do, for their kids to go to school in a month or a week. I mean, so that's something that I think needs to be addressed and needs to be worked on, because these children are our future, and we know it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. We'll have a very short second round, and we will limit the time, but I just have a couple of quick questions regarding the government of Rwanda and DRC had sort of had, contentions throughout the years. And I know that there was an agreement signed in November 2007 in Kenya that sort of started to have a better work relationship. How is the work relationship going between the two countries? Have they established diplomatic ties? They were going to exchange ambassadors. Perhaps at one time they did lower level. How's that moving along? Mr. Carson, Ambassador.
Mr. Chairman, the relationship between the Democratic Republic of the Congo and Rwanda has improved dramatically over the last 18 months, and certainly is a marked improvement over where it was 5, 6, 7, or 8 years ago. The improvement can be seen in a number of areas. One, there has in fact been an exchange of diplomatic relations. Both countries have now opened up embassies in their respective capitals, and they have also exchanged ambassadors. The two presidents, President Kagame of Rwanda and President Kabila of the DRC, have met on several occasions, and we hear that they, in fact, do talk to one another telephonically on a periodic basis. But probably the most dramatic sign of the improvement between the two countries occurred approximately 15, 16 months ago when the government of President Kabila permitted the Rwandan government to send troops across the border into the eastern Congo in order to help to flush out some of the rebel groups who were a part of the old Interahamwe. The Rwandan troops stayed for several months and then went back across the border. They have not been back again. That was done with the permission of the DRC government and the permission of President Kabila. But relations have improved significantly. We hope that they will remain on an upward trajectory. It is absolutely essential that they work together at all levels and very collaboratively if the problems of that region are to be resolved.
Thank you. I know that Rwanda has several battalions of peacekeepers in Darfur, and I just wonder how significant is that, and how are their contribution in the peacekeeping in Darfur working?
The Rwandan government is to be complimented on its commitment to peacekeeping efforts not only in Darfur but in other parts of Africa. They have a very skilled and professional army, and their soldiers have turned out to be very able peacekeepers. They have performed extremely well according to reports that we have seen in their engagement in Darfur, and a senior Rwandan officer has also served as a senior commander in the UN peacekeeping mission in that region. So in Darfur, they get a very positive and high mark for their peacekeeping commitment and performance.
And finally, about Rwanda, with the large tens of thousands of people who had taken part in the genocide and many that are still in detention, a large number through the Kachacha system have been released. And how is that system working, and do you see the speeding up of the release of more of the people who are incarcerated?
The Kachacha system has worked extraordinarily well given the large number of individuals who were involved in the genocide in 1994, where there were clearly not just hundreds but thousands of individuals across the country who were complicitous in some of the enormous violence that went on from April to November of '94. The Kachasha system, of course, is a uniquely Rwandan system. It has been effective. We continue to monitor its operations, and we certainly encourage the Rwandan government to exercise with care the rights of all of those who are in Kachasha detention situations, and that those who, in fact, are rehabilitated and should be released. But the system has run fairly well.
Thank you. And just finally, Mr. Moore, with the social issues going on in Uganda, the anti-gay legislation, homosexual legislation, has the USAID attempted to work with government officials or in trying to sort of explain or work with them in their governance of having such extreme, I mean, some of the legislation was pretty extreme. How have we dealt with that from USAID standpoint?
I don't think we've dealt with it directly. What we have tended to do is we look at Uganda in the area of governance is to try to find those areas where, on a local level, where civil society and NGOs and local governance at a local area can come together around some things that are positive in terms of moving those communities forward. And then, based upon that relationship at local areas, see how that can be moved up to a national level so that there are those same alliances that are working to solve problems. So we probably have worked more on the process of solving problems than we have on looking at any particular thing that one may or may not decide is problematic.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador Carson, could you tell us what the total amount of direct and indirect funding, U.S. funding, for the Kenya Constitution reform process is, including money to the Committee of Experts, drafting, the civic program that is now underway? And secondly, what has been the U.S. position on the extraordinarily controversial part of that, which would legalize abortion for health reasons?
Congressman Smith, I cannot tell you, but I certainly will find out how much we have spent in supporting the reform of the democratic reform of the Constitution in Kenya. And so that number probably is available, and I will make an earnest effort to get it.
And could you provide us the information on what role, if any, we played with regards to the extremely controversial piece of that, which has been so named by even the Committee on Experts? The chairman of it said that that is one of the top most controversial aspects to it, that Kenya will go from a country that protected its children in almost every instance, its unborn children, to being an abortion on demand a country if this were to be ratified by the people.
We will find out, but again, we have not been involved in the internal deliberations of any particular clauses or amendments to the Constitution. What we have encouraged the Kenyan authorities to do is to produce a constitution which in effect incorporates all of the key elements of a strong democratic institution.
Let me ask you, a little over 2 years ago, the UN Population Fund and China's Population Control Police invited the health ministers and other top officials in sub-Saharan African countries to Beijing to talk about child limitation policies. When that meeting was over, at least one very high official, Paul Kagame of Rwanda, said that he wanted to implement a 3-child-per-couple policy. Now, as I think you know, Mr. Ambassador, China's policy of 1 child per couple is among the cruelest violations of women's rights in human history. Children, there are missing at least 100 million girls, feticide, gendercide, I should say, where children are targeted because of their gender, killed by abortion simply because they happen to be a female. It's outrageous, and yet this has been enabled by the UNFPA since 1979. The international community has been largely silent, and now we see countries in Africa actively looking at whether or not they need that kind of child limitation. I would point out parenthetically that Margaret Sanger, in her books, and she actually wrote a book called Child Limitation, talked about the cruelty of charity, of helping indigent women have children. She wrote it in her book, The Pivot of Civilization. She is the founder of Planned Parenthood, and she made it very clear that there are certain ethnicities, certain people who should not procreate, and Africans were among those that she singled out that should not have children. Absolutely racist, in my opinion. She was a eugenicist, no doubt about it. She clearly stated that anyone who is handicapped, disabled in any way, shouldn't be allowed to live. So having said that, Kagame's statement about a 3-child-per-couple policy, in my opinion, and many others I would suggest, is very dangerous to children. It shreds the welcome mat for a child. And I know, Mr. Moore, you talked about population pressures. You talked about the growth. I would hope that wouldn't become a pretext for the U.S. government supporting a child limitation policy, whether it be 3 children per couple or, as we see in the PRC, the 1 child. It inevitably leads to coercion, and it makes children profoundly unwelcomed. Do we take a position on child limitation? Yeah, that is the Obama administration.
Congressman Smith, I am unaware of the conference that you just mentioned, in which the Chinese government invited healthcare officials from Africa to attend. We'll certainly look at it and see what the history of this is. And this is actually the first time that I have heard anything about President Kagame of Rwanda having a 3-child per family policy. I'm totally unaware of that as well. So
Mr. Moore, are you? If you could check into it, I actually raised it with Paul Kagame myself. He acknowledged that it's accurate, but again, the false sense that economic growth, like what's going on in China, I mean, China is facing, economists now are beginning to recognize not only, can men not find women to marry because they're missing, they've been killed by sex selection abortions, but the economic, problems that they will soon begin to see are potentially catastrophic. And I hope there will be lessons learned from China that are not misapplied because he came back feeling if you want economic growth, you need child limitation policies. Do we, and please get back maybe for the record, but do we, in drafting legislation, in any way encourage the inclusion of abortion with countries like Uganda, with countries like Rwanda? Do you know?
I believe so. The answer to that is no.
Okay. Let me ask you, in terms of the moratorium on ARVs, if you could elaborate on the impacts that's having on the unmet need, the men and women who are HIV positive, and whether or not anyone else is picking up the slack. And given the fact that many people will die, will you be coming to Congress or looking to take monies from other accounts and make sure that perhaps we grow that number? Because I talk to a lot of the partners in the field, and they're very concerned that huge numbers of people will die because the ARVs were not available to them. You're going to get back on that?
I will get back to you.
I appreciate it, Mr. Moore. Just finally, if I could ask you about the military training of the Light Infantry Battalion that we are providing. Years ago, when we trained up Kopassus in Indonesia, we heard reports of human rights abuses for those that we had trained. I actually convened a hearing went to Indonesia as Habibie took over from the Suharto regime, and people that we had trained, we believe, but we could never prove it, in urban guerrilla warfare were actually killing people in the streets. My question to you is, what kind of human rights training are we providing? Are we keeping track of the trainees to ensure that there's accountability? And how many trainers are there? Where is this actually happening? Could you provide us the who, what, when, where, and I know the why of it, but maybe that as well, because obviously it's a good idea. We want to train professional military men and women with good components of anti-human trafficking and human rights concerns, but if you could give us the whole package on that, I would deeply appreciate it.
We certainly will. Just 2 quick sentences. We vet all of the individuals who participate in our military training programs according to the Leahy Amendment. And with respect to the training that is going on in Kisangani right now, a portion of that training is devoted to human rights protection and respect for the civil liberties of civilians. It is an integral part of what our people on the ground are teaching to the unit that is being trained by the U.S.
And just one final thing. Will Uganda back us, the U.S.-led effort on the Iranian sanctions at the Security Council?
Let me say that I sincerely hope so. That was the purpose of my visit to Uganda last week. I hope that the Ugandans will, in fact, support us. It is absolutely essential that they do.
Let me thank both of you for this excellent hearing. We've gotten a lot of information out. We really appreciate it. We'll be following up on a few issues, but once again, thank you. I also like to commend my members. 9 members at a subcommittee hearing is very commendable, and so I appreciate their interest. So with that, I ask unanimous consent to enter testimony from John Pendergrass of the Enough campaign into the record. Without objection, so ordered. And also, I ask unanimous consent that members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks without objection. Thank you very much. The meeting stands adjourned.